Thank you, praise team. Thank you, choir, Connor, John, and there's all sorts of folks that are always involved in these services that you don't get to see. Folks in the back, checking doors, security teams, the sound booth, the AV, all of it is an act of worship. This is sermon number 4 out of 6 as we continue our little series through the entirety of the Bible in 6 weeks. So we started in Genesis, and we have been homiletically sprinting. Is that a fair? Yeah. It's been a homiletical sprint through the Bible, and today we will break into the New Testament. Our story started with a promise to a family. God gave Abraham a threefold promise. I will give you a good land, I will give you descendants like the stars in the sky, and I will use you to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. That family grows, and out of its promise, it continues to spread and expand until they eventually find themselves enslaved in Egypt and are rescued by that same God of promise, who adds to their number a mixed multitude. And God establishes them as this new kind of people, expanding Abraham's promise to all of them at Mount Sinai. Eventually, once in the land, they develop from roaming nomads into a confederation of related tribes and eventually a nation called to be a different kind of kingdom, called to be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, a nation meant to show the world what God is like and to draw the world towards this God. But as the story goes, they eventually collapse under the weight of their sin, their injustice, their idolatry, their wealth leads them to disaster. The nation splits. The northern kingdom is destroyed by Assyria, and the southern kingdom of Judah goes into exile in Babylon. And for decades, they wait. They waited for God to act again. They waited for the promises to be fulfilled. They waited for a new exodus. They waited for a new king, a new leader. And then the prophets, they begin to speak the words of God to them. Isaiah says, "Comfort, comfort my people." Isaiah says, "Prepare a way." Isaiah says, "Forget the former things. See, I'm going to do something new." And a new exodus does come. They return to the land, but they're never really free again. Empire after empire, Persia, Greece, Rome, they're home, but they're somehow still in exile, always ruled over by someone else, always waiting for the story to start moving again. Then Matthew opens his gospel with this: Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. A son of David, the broken dynasty, the legendary king of the glory days? Well, of course, the Messiah would be a son of David. It was Solomon, a son of David, after all, that started the degradation of the nation. It would make sense, right, for another son of David to come to the rescue. A son of Abraham, the mythic ancestral leader of this whole people, the one whose promises they still live on, still cling to, the one whose connection to God started the whole story. That Abraham? The Abraham who was promised that his descendants would bless all the families of the earth? Of course, the Messiah would be a son of Abraham. This is Abraham's family, Abraham's promise. This is David's throne. Jesus is the next step in the story. John begins his gospel with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made. And in him was life, and that life was the light to all mankind. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. God doesn't call a new family. God doesn't choose a new people or just send another prophet or raise another king. God steps into the story. And when God does, everything starts to move again. Because Jesus doesn't just continue the story. Jesus knows the whole story. He knows where it's been going. He knows what's gone wrong with the beloved people. He knows how, when, and why the plan to bless all the families of the earth went off the rails. Jesus confronts it. Jesus corrects it. Jesus responds and reopens things that have been closed. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus' first sermon comes in chapter 4. Fresh out of his testing in the wilderness, Jesus goes back to the town where he grew up and preaches his first sermon. John, would you read that for us this morning?
He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day he went to the synagogue, as was his custom, and he stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me, to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue was fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing."
Thank you, John. Good news to the poor, freedom for the captives, recovery of sight, release of the oppressed. And the year of the Lord's favor there is a callback to the celebration of the Jubilee. Do you remember that from last week? Total economic reset. And then he says, today this has been fulfilled. And he gives a very short sermon. He says, "I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years and there was severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman, an enemy, a Syrian." The next verse tells us that the people are furious with this brief sermon, so angry that the congregation of worshipers morphs into a murderous mob and intends to throw Jesus off a cliff. So why were folks so mad about what Jesus said? I mean, it seems like good stuff, right? Good news to the poor, sight to the blind, freedom for the prisoner and the oppressed, the celebration, the cancellation of debt, a fresh start. So why would it make these folks so mad? Perhaps it's because of where Jesus decided to stop his reading that morning. You see, Jesus actually stops in the passage John just read in the middle of a sentence. Jesus finished the reading with, "to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." But that's not where the reading was supposed to end. Jesus literally cuts the passage off mid-sentence. The full phrase is to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. You can imagine, as an oppressed and conquered people, that this congregation might have really been looking forward to a word about vengeance against their enemies. But Jesus stops with a word of blessing instead. And detecting the discomfort in the room, he elaborates by talking about how the great prophets of the past performed miracles and healings for enemies. sometimes even instead of offering those blessings to their own people. If this gospel is going to be good news, it's going to be good news for everyone. This is the next step in the ever-widening aperture of God's welcome, the expanding nature of divine hospitality. The next phase in the plan to, here's Genesis 12:3 again, bless all the families of the earth. And from here, Jesus starts calling disciples, and they're not the best. They're not the best, they're not the most religious, they're not the cleanest. In fact, the simple reality that these men aren't already following some rabbi was a good sign that they weren't conventionally cut out for this type of calling. If they were any good at this stuff, someone would have snagged them by now. But when Jesus goes out to find the people he will teach, that he will travel with, that he will train for ministry, when he goes out to choose those who will represent him after his earthly ministry, the people who will carry this message to the ends of the world, to all the families of the earth, he starts with the not good enoughs. He called tax collectors, these folks seen as race traitors. They chose to stand with the oppressive empire against their own people. He called fishermen, uneducated, seen as low class. Some of these men, like Peter, were hot-tempered and not the best team players. He called the young, like John. He called a zealot, a member of a violent political sect, a terrorist from the Roman perspective. And that's just talking about the main 12 disciples of the inner circle. There was also with Jesus a mixed multitude. Luke 8 tells us about the women that traveled with him. The opening of that chapter reads, "The 12 were with him and also some women." It even names Mary, called Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and, quote, many others. These women supported and funded Jesus' traveling ministry. They were essential to the work and part of the team that was traveling and learning from Jesus. And this shouldn't be surprising, the strangeness of this cohort. Jesus was constantly around the wrong people. In Matthew 8, a Roman centurion, part of the vast system that was oppressing the Judeans, came and asked Jesus to heal a member of his household, saying that Jesus was so powerful as to just give the command and the near-death man would be healed. Verse 10 and 11 says, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to the followers with him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from east and west and take their place at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." This is what Jesus says to the contemporary enemies of his people. But there is also a story in Matthew 15 where Jesus heals the daughter of a woman who pursues his crew, repeatedly harassing and begging Jesus for help. This is that strange passage with the conversation about children and masters and dogs and who eats where. And if it feels familiar, it's because it happens in Mark's gospel too. Mark, writing to a Roman audience, calls this woman a Syrophoenician, a geographic term that would make sense to his audience. But Matthew, writing for a Jewish audience, calls her a Canaanite. The Canaanites were the ancient enemies of the Israelites. And Jesus heals this woman's daughter and commends her for her, quote, great faith. Does anyone remember the parable of the Good Samaritan found in Luke 10, 33 to 37? It's a pretty popular one. You've probably heard it. I won't rehash it. Jesus tells a story, a Jewish man beaten and left for dead on the side of the road, and the hero of the story is not one of God's people who are given the chance. It's an outsider, the Samaritan. Now, why does that matter? When the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians, they relocated other subjugated peoples into the region. these outsiders intermarried with the Israelite survivors, and they formed a new people group with their own blended culture, blended race, and blended religion. These people now occupied the region between Judea in the south and the Galilee in the north. And the Jews of Jesus' day would go, instead of just a straight line south to north, they'd go on this crazy out-of-the-way path to avoid even passing through Samaritan territory. Didn't even want to touch their dirt. They thought of these people as half-breeds, as perverse and blasphemous and dangerous enemies. And Jesus casts one of these hated Samaritans as the hero in his story. Jesus is reshaping the imaginations of his followers. He also demonstrates his welcome to the Samaritans in John 4 when Jesus reveals his identity to the, quote, woman at the well, a woman who would become a missionary evangelizing her town. How else does Jesus demonstrate the kingdom of God through his actions? Mark 10, Matthew 19, and Luke 18, we see Jesus welcoming children, those expected to be seen and not heard. We have 6 different instances of Jesus healing lepers, folks deemed so dangerous and unclean because of their disease that they were forced to live outside of the rest of the community. Everywhere Jesus goes, barriers start collapsing. The outsider is welcomed. The unclean is embraced. The forgotten are seen. The enemy is loved. And eventually, this sort of radical welcome, this radical hospitality, radical love leads Jesus into conflict. Conflict with the status quo, conflict with the religious system, conflict with the powers of his day. Eventually, it leads to this fight in Jerusalem. In John 12, when Jesus talks about his coming execution, he says, "When I am lifted up from the earth," talking about the cross, "I will draw all people to myself." Not some people, not one nation, not a chosen race, not just a certain class. All people will be drawn to me, he says. Do you hear Abraham's promise echoing in that? The dream of God to bless all the families of the earth. On the night before his death, Jesus sits at a table with his disciples. He breaks bread and he lifts a cup of wine and he says, "This is my blood, the blood of a new covenant, poured out for you and for many." The covenant is expanding again. The welcome is widening again. The family is growing again. And then Jesus goes to the cross. And Matthew tells us that Jesus cried out in a loud voice and gave up his spirit. And at that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The curtain in the temple separated the Holy of Holies, the most holy space, the actual presence of God from the rest of the world. Only one person once a year could get that close to God. And that curtain, that barrier, the veil, that wall, the thing separating humanity from the presence of God was torn, not pulled back, not cracked open, ruined, destroyed, torn in two. The separation is over. The story that began with Abraham is breaking wide open. The blessing is moving outward again. And then the risen Jesus stands before his disciples and gives them the Great Commission, saying, "Go and make disciples of all nations." There it is again, all nations, not just Israel, not just the chosen, not just Jerusalem, not just the people who look right, who act right, who vote right, who talk right, who worship right. All nations, the family of God on the move, the kingdom breaking into the world, the hospitality of God widens. And now the mission of Jesus becomes the mission of the church, to go to welcome, to bless, to make room, to tear down barriers, and to resist building them. Because this is where the story has always been going, from one family to all the families of the earth. The invitation that Jesus gives his disciples is the same invitation that he offers to us, to embrace an identity, and with it, a mission, to find a place in the family, but not for our own sake. That blessing, just like the blessing offered to Abraham, is meant to be turned outwards. So my invitation for you today, it's twofold. Like so many of the promises of God, it's got multiple pieces. If you have never found yourself in the family of God, if you've not made, a lot of times we'll talk about making a decision to accept Jesus, if you haven't said yes to this ever-widening family of God, that opening is still here and ready and available for you. There is a place for you in the family of God. And if you have said yes to Jesus, if you have accepted the work that he's done and found your place, it's time to find your purpose in the family of God, because it's always focused outwards. We come here to gather, to worship, to replenish, but the point of being here is to go out there and be the family of God, the kingdom of God, to do the blessing that your blessings have enabled. And so there's two kinds of invitations today: to say yes to Jesus and to say yes to what Jesus has asked you to do. If your response to that needs to be voiced, if you need to tell someone that you're joining the team or making a change or stepping up to what you know God has called you to, I'll be down here to receive you. If you need a hug, if you need a prayer, I'll be down here for that too. Would you stand and continue in worship with us?